My name is Renee Klein. I'm a 18-year homeowner here in Jefferson County, and I am delighted to be your moderator tonight. Thank you for coming out. Coming out to participate in our democracy by actively listening to candidates and the issues and posing tough questions is one of the most important things you can do. So thank you for your interest, and thank you for being here to ask questions. Let's see, we've got a couple of things to talk about tonight. We have some people here we want to recognize. I do want to acknowledge the Peninsula Daily News is here. We appreciate it when media comes out. Media remains one of the most important parts of our democracy. I don't see anyone else here from media, but if the leaders here wave at me if I missed you. You know that we are here tonight to hear from candidates for two positions for our representatives in the state legislature in Olympia, positions 1 and positions 2 for the 24th Legislative District, of which we are part of. And as you know, we are sponsored by the American Association of University Women and the League of Women Voters, and we appreciate those organizations. You'll hear from them in just a moment. I want to introduce some of the volunteers tonight. So in the back in the green sweatshirt, we have Gary Embrecht, who is our sound person. Yay, Gary. And the handsome man standing in front of the camera is Dennis Deneau. Videographer to the stars, no, to Port Townsend in Jefferson County. And so if you'd like to look at tonight's proceedings, he will be posting these videos. He does this on each of these candidate forums, for which we're very grateful. It will air on PTTV, but also on YouTube. So if you put in YouTube and you put in his name, Dennis, with 2 N's, Deneau, D-A-N-E-A-U, you can find the proceedings from tonight. And that'll be within a week, Dennis?
Next few days.
Next few days. Okay, so he stays up all night doing this, so thank you. Thank you for applauding for those volunteers. We also have some folks from the League and from AUW. We'll let you applaud for them in a few moments, too. After that, we're going to ask that you hold applause when the candidates speak. We're asking that we're here to learn and to listen respectfully tonight, and the best way to do that is if we not applaud and we not cheer or make any sort of sounds, positive or negative, until the very end, and then we'll ask you to applaud for the candidates one time. But if you please would just listen respectfully and make sure you don't applaud. So if you're tempted, you can make little fists with your hands, or like I said last time, you can hold hands with the person next to you if you know them and you ask permission. Okay, so before we hear from the candidates, we'd like to hear from our 2 representatives, our sponsoring organization. So Jackie Asif, who is with the League of Women Voters. Jackie?
Thank you, and welcome everybody. We've got a little donation can back there to pay for the venue, so if you feel like donating, that would be great. We're having another forum tomorrow night in Port Townsend at the Community Center. Jennifer James Wilson will be giving a little talk about the Proposition 1, which involves the Port Townsend School District and how we elect board members, and then it will be the county commissioner candidates as well. And I just wanted to tell you about the League position on some of these initiatives. Initiative 940, which is the concerns law enforcement, requiring law enforcement to receive violence de-escalation and mental health and first aid training, and to provide first aid and change standards for use of deadly force. The League endorses that, and also endorses Initiative 1631, which is the measure that would charge pollution fees on sources of greenhouse gas polluters and use the revenue to reduce pollution. It also endorses Initiative 1639, which would require increased background checks, training, age limits, and waiting periods for sales or delivery of semi-automatic assault rifles. And Initiative 1634, which is the tax on certain drink items. The League did not take a position on that. But just be careful with all these ads, because big money is pouring in like crazy. And PACs are not required to tell the truth. So do not make judgments just on a TV ad, and do some investigation yourself. If you want to get the League's opinion on any of this stuff, you could go to LWVWA, and there's a lot of information there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. And Catherine Buchanan from AUW.
I want to thank you all for coming here and participating in our democratic process, and thank our candidates for just doing everything they can to make everybody know what they stand for and what they believe. So I would like to welcome you. The AUW in Port Townsend has been in existence for over 70 years, and we have over 200 members supporting education for women and girls and equality for everybody in the school system. Thank you.
So here's how the day is going to go. Our candidates will open each with a 3-minute opening statement, and we are going to start in alphabetical order. So you're going to go first, Representative Chapman, and then Jodi Wilke, and then we're going to ask questions, and there are a couple of ways you can ask questions. You're welcome to write a question on a note card in the back and bring it up to me, or you can ask Debbie's back there in the back. You might ask someone to run it up for you if you need to. But we also have a microphone in the back, and we'd love you to just go step up to the mic if you'd like and ask the question directly yourself. Please speak directly into the mic so that everything can be recorded well for sound and so that everyone can hear. 3-minute opening statements with the questions. The candidates will each have 2 minutes to answer the questions. And Catherine's going to show a yellow card that looks like this one when we've got 1 minute left or 2 minutes left, depending on where they're at in their statement. And then a red card when they're out of time. So out of time means you're going to start to hear from me otherwise. So that's how that will go. When we get done, we're going to take a little 5-minute intermission. We'll thank everyone. That's when you can go back to the back and have some refreshments. And don't forget the little bucket out there for donations. The League and AUW pay for this space. So if you're so inclined to help offset those costs, we would appreciate it. I think those are all. If you ask a question, please be clear and succinct with your question. We don't want to have us rambling. We want to hear from the candidates. Otherwise, I think that's it. So it looks like a lot of you have been to these forums before. It's probably not your first rodeo. Not for you guys either, huh? You've been doing a lot of this, I'm sure. Any questions from me? All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We are starting with position 1 for our 24th Legislative District. And incumbent Mike Chapman, Democrat, you get your first opening statement.
Okay, well, hey, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you to AAUW and the League for sponsoring these forums. I always am kind of reflected that these are a little bit of a Norman Rockwell moment where people from around the area come into a community gathering to listen to their candidates running for local office, and I think that's what part of the heartbeat maybe of our district is how engaged our citizens are and how engaged people are with campaigns like ours, and all the way down to the local campaigns as well. So I thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule. I'm Representative Mike Chapman. Prior to serving as your state representative, I served 4 terms as a Clallam County Commissioner, and prior to serving as a Clallam County Commissioner, I had a 10-year law enforcement career. So I'm proud to say this is my 28th year of uninterrupted public service, and I believe that public service is a worthy vocation, is a worthy avocation. And as your state representative, I think I did some good things in Olympia. First and foremost, I'm proud that I was able to secure, as a member of the Transportation Committee, $32 million for a brand new Elwha River Bridge, which is a huge component of our transportation corridor, both for our economy, but just for people moving from east and west. That was not on the project replacement list. It was on a repair list, and so I went to the chair of the Transportation Committee in my first session, and I said, we've got to replace this bridge. No ifs, ands, or buts. Worked with the stakeholders, and we secured $32 million. That bridge is being designed, and the old bridge is will be open while we build the new bridge in place, and so that was a major piece of public infrastructure for this district. Another issue that I'm really proud of is that I worked on a bipartisan bill that passed the House floor 98-0, and it passed the Senate with only one dissenting vote, and that was a bill to allow rural residents, rural students to go to our rural colleges to be trained for rural jobs that exist in rural Washington, and it's a public-private scholarship opportunity where companies can say, hey, we need job skills training, and we have the jobs that are open, and we'll pledge some money, and then the state can also match that. And we're seeing just this fall, the Grays Harbor Community College started a log truck driving certification program with private and public money, and Weyerhaeuser and some other timber companies. Who would have known that there's a shortage of log truck drivers, but there are. And so those job skills for the jobs that exist in rural Washington, and there's a number of them, our rural economy is actually rebounding. It's doing much better, and we need to train the next generation of workforce. So public infrastructure, training the next generation of workforce. And then a third thing that I'm really really passionate about is just our rural economy. I chair the House Democrats' Rural Economic Development Team, and we're working on a package to provide some targeted business and occupation tax cuts, specifically around manufacturers, small manufacturers in rural communities like ours. And I think it'll help attract maybe a cross-laminated timber manufacturer, maybe a door company that can expand. And if we target those tax cuts, it'll help spur on economic growth in rural Washington. So those are a few things that I worked on. I'm sure we'll talk about maybe some other ideas and other issues as we move along. So again, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Wilke. No clapping, thanks.
I am glad to be here, and I am glad to see the community come out here too. It's kind of nice to see some friendly faces, people that I know from around Port Townsend. I think it's really great that we can come together in a situation like this, and many of us probably do disagree on the issues, but the important thing is that we're here engaging and we're talking with one another in a civil and friendly manner, and we're able to discuss issues that are different. We have different points of view on these and still go home and remain friendly with one another. And so I'm really actually very happy to see some of the people that I know here who we are not necessarily on the same political side, but we're on the same human side. So that's super important, especially these days in the political climate that we have. I am all about communicating with people. I'm all about getting out into the district and discussing issues with everybody that I've met. And I found so much information as I've traveled, looking forward to meeting people and finding out what's important to them. And so I'm just going to list a few of the things that I think are important that I'd like to address when I get into Olympia. One question that I want to ask you, are proposed tax increases, are those a partisan or a bipartisan issue? I think that we all found out in Port Townsend, in this area, Jefferson County last year, that tax increases for the sake of tax increases are not necessarily good for the community, and I think that we need to take a look at the increases that are being proposed as to whether or not those are actually going to help us or not. The carbon tax was voted down in the past, and yet here it is again on the ballot. The PUD is against it. The trade unions are against it. There are a lot of people that are against it. Plus, it has carve-outs for major companies who are contributors to the carbon issue. I think that we need to take a close look at that one. Issues of gun rights, many of us may not agree on those, but that initiative has a lot of onerous components to it that even if you are a proponent of gun control, there may be some aspects of that that you just find unacceptable. Housing is a nonpartisan issue. We can all agree that we need better housing in just about everywhere throughout the district. And I think that there's some changes that can be made at the state level that will help all of us, that will loosen up the housing market for the free market and allow builders to get in there and do what they do best. Because let's face it, sometimes when government is in control of these things, they don't always do the most efficient job. So those are some of the things that I'd really like to work towards as I focus very strongly on helping the community, which is why I got into this in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, so we're going to open up for questions. So again, if you'd like to ask a question at the microphone, please step to the back. I do have a few starter questions, so head to the microphone while I read this first one, and this is for both of you, and we're going to alternate again who answers the question first or second. So Ms. Wilke, we'll start with you. Some people have said there are barriers to low-cost housing. As a state legislator, what are those barriers, and how will you remove or reduce them?
I agree, and we found that in Port Townsend last year when we were discussing Proposition 1. So some of the barriers that are in the way of affordable housing or low-cost housing involve things like zoning, and especially things related to the Growth Management Act. There are a lot of opportunities in that huge bill to make carve-outs for rural communities. Things like the urban growth zones, urban growth areas that require to have big city infrastructure in place in order to be able to qualify for grants that will help help build infrastructure that's needed to develop these housing areas, and for small businesses to be able to have a larger size office buildings and larger size warehouses, those sorts of things. So I would like to see there's loan programs that are available, but most of those are only offered to nonprofit or government organizations. There's things like that that can be done if we reach our hand out across the aisle to different private enterprises and allow them to do what they do in the private industry. We will see more supply of housing come about. Allowing there to be more density would be really beneficial, and it would increase the supply, which would bring down the costs. So those are some of the things that I would like to work on as far as benefiting the public in that area.
So this is an important issue that the legislature worked on the last session, and then there's some new ideas moving forward. Two bills that passed will allow cities and counties to pass new legislation where they can allow smaller houses as part of their footprint. Bainbridge Island actually has a really unique program right now where they're kind of allowing property owners to condominiumize their piece of property for a smaller dwelling and actually creating a separate tax parcel, and then they're able to sell those and rent them and lease them at a much lower rate. So cities now have that authority. We had a bill that would have returned some sales tax back to cities to put in for public infrastructure for affordable housing projects, and I think that's a bill that'll see some new life in the new session. And another idea is that if we ask the cities specifically and local governments to maybe reduce some of the fees and some of the impact fees that they have to charge, I think the state should come up with some grant money to reimburse the city because they still have to complete the work and they still have salaries to pay. So I was talking to a Republican just the other day, and so we're going to work together on a piece of legislation to allow cities to say, we'll reduce the impact fees, we'll reduce some of the permit fees, and the state could possibly come up with a pot of money. Finally, I think there's some exciting new projects on the peninsula, one in Port Angeles that Representative Theringer is the chair of the capital budget and myself supported, and it's the new housing authority where 30 older, dilapidated homes full of lead paint, asbestos, bad wiring were removed. And if you go by Port Angeles off of Lawrence and Boulevard, and I recently toured that job site, you're going to see modern, affordable housing, much better footprint. There's going to be a park for kids. There's some new infrastructure being put in place. And that was, again, a public-private partnership with some private financing. Obviously, the federal government had a huge role, but the state was able to come up with a nice pot of money for the infrastructure. And their next project is going to be a brand-new Boys and Girls Club, which will also serve as a community evacuation and emergency center. So it's going to be built to modern earthquake standards. So we'll have a modern, really a beautiful Boys and Girls Club. Then stage 3 will start about this time next year.
Hi, my name is Jennifer James Wilson, and I've served on the school board in Port Townsend this is my 9th year. And having attended a legislative assembly recently of the school directors over in Spokane, I found that one of the things that is top of mind is gun prevention and school violence and gun prevention, or gun prevention of school violence. And thinking about just kind of doing an internal survey in Port Townsend, we've done a lot of things to build resiliency and protection for our students. We have a lot of social and emotional supports. We have counseling. We have a well-worn groove between Jumping Mouse and our elementary school. We have school-based medical and mental health clinics. We have cameras and security systems, and we still are not bulletproof. And what I would like to ask both of you is what, if anything, are you willing to do legislatively to help us protect our children against gun violence?
Yeah, that's obviously, as a former law enforcement officer, something that I'm familiar with and take very seriously. There was a great proposal that was working through the Senate that actually Senator Vandeweghe was taking the lead on, and it was in a short session. It just didn't make it. And so it would have come up with a very comprehensive approach to school safety, including funding for school districts if they wanted to hire school safety officers. But it was a comprehensive approach to this problem, not just there was an amendment that was added to the budget at the last minute that actually was voted down because of the comprehensive approach that the Senate was working on. We still thought that actually had a chance to make it through the Senate. It's a tricky issue because it would added cost. But I'm very confident that the legislature will not leave the next session without taking a comprehensive approach to school safety. And many of us have worked on individual pieces of legislation that we thought would have made the community safer. Some of those pieces of legislation are now on the initiative before you. I support raising the age from 18 to 21 before people buy an assault weapon. It's already 21 to buy a pistol. I believe in safe storage laws, and so we were already trying to make the communities a little safer, but the Senate bill is really the right vehicle moving forward for comprehensive school safety. We failed this last session. We didn't get it done.
According to my research, at any rate, in the House, Mr. Chapman did vote against the resource officers, the bill for $30 million to pay for resource officers in schools, which is unfortunate. I had a nice conversation out in Forks just Monday morning with the students at the Forks High School, and this is a big deal to them. They're very concerned about it. But one of the issues that they're also concerned about is, as our questioner mentioned, having support on a counseling level in the schools to sort of prevent that mindset that puts kids or mentally ill people in a position where they want to perpetrate an attack. And I really like that idea. I think that it's really great that the kids are thinking that way, thinking proactively about it. So I was really supportive of that idea. Because in my mind, the issue with gun violence is so much more an issue of social concerns. It's a mental issue. It's an issue of malice of heart. It's an issue of criminal intent. And I think as long as we're focusing the matter to be just strictly on the hardware rather than the software, we avoid an opportunity to address a social issue that's extremely important. We have a lot of mentally ill people that are not getting this kind of support that they need, and our mental illness in this state just is non-functional at best. So definitely would like to see some support along those lines, and address the real problem, not a red herring, not a shiny thing, which I think is the big problem, a bigger problem, that we are not brave enough to face the problem head on. So I think that resource officers in the schools provide multiple benefits, including psychological support.
Thank you. Time's up.
Hi, my name is Jodi Wilke, and I'm a member of the Jefferson County Move to Amend group, and we're really concerned about the money in politics and the growing power of corporations over people. And Initiative 735 was passed in 2016 by Washington voters, and it calls on Congress and the Washington legislature to pass a constitutional amendment to establish that constitutional rights apply to natural persons only and not to corporations, and that campaign contributions are not speech and must be regulated. It would reverse Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United and reduce the growing power of corporations over the rights of people. So my question is, do you pledge to support this constitutional amendment? And if elected to represent us in the legislature, will you vote to pass a memorial resolution for this amendment?
I'm just going to speak straight with you. Unfortunately, you and I will differ on this matter. Being a person who's owned a business in the past, I don't feel like my opportunity to voice my opinion should stop just because I incorporate my business. And if I want to use the money for a business that I have grown in political ways, I should be allowed to do that. The unions are certainly allowed to do that, right? So I just think that people, there's incorporating gives personhood to a business in order that they cannot be sued for things that happen in the business. And I think that personhood should go ahead and be extended to political political speech as well. We're just not going to agree on that issue. I think that also, since I have a little bit of time left, I want to circle back to an issue that Mike brought up about the housing issue over in Port Angeles. And he wants to characterize the homes that were thrown into the dumpster from the Peninsula Housing Authority as beat-up, dilapidated, old ruined houses with bad wiring and asbestos. I've actually been in some of those houses that were able to be moved off that property. And the fact of the matter is that because of lack of planning on that regard, they threw away, literally threw into the dumpster, $3 million worth of housing. That's 15 houses that were valued when complete at $200,000 by appraisal. Those houses cost $100,000 to move off of that property and set up on other property. And in fact, the person that I spoke to who gave me a tour of her house pays $400 per month mortgage for that house. That is a low-cost home. Those are homes that could have been used to help, and they were not old and dilapidated.
Time is up. And Mr. Chapman, Representative Chapman, if you go back to answer the questioner's first question, please.
I supported the initiative. I support the move to amend. Strongly believing I'd love to get money out of politics. Thought about this campaign, quite frankly, of kind of unilaterally disarming myself, but I think the seat, holding this seat and the work that I do is too important to not raise any money. So I would love to have a public financing of campaigns where we both get $25,000. We both spend 6 months making our case to the voters. I'm trying to run a very shoestring budget this year and not spending near as much money as I've raised. Don't want to raise money. Don't do fundraise. I go to fundraisers, but I don't put out a fundraising letter. So we've got it, and corporations are not people. Corporations are corporations, and corporations have tremendous advantages that you and I will never have. Tax advantages. They're not people. I mean, they're corporations. And you know, you and I will all have an ending date. None of us will leave this world. We'll all leave this world at some point. Corporations date back to into the 1800s. There is no guaranteed ending date of a corporation. So to say corporations are people, in essence, and it has allowed them then the dark money that they're allowed to put in, and that's during the primary. I hate to say this, but my opponent put out flyers that came from another group outside the area saying that I was the most liberal member of the state of the Washington State Legislature. She had nothing to do with it. It was another group who came into our area and mailed out flyers, 2 of them. One came to some of my relatives, really criticizing me and distorting my record, said that I'd voted for every tax increase in the legislature. I actually haven't voted for any tax increase in my time in the legislature. So that's what dark money does. It can come into a district, it can influence a local election. So give us each $25,000. Public financing, we make our case, let's shorten our election season, and you all will make the best decision that you do every time we stand for election.
Some candidates have suggested offering corporations a B&O tax exemption to encourage them to locate to Washington. Do you support such tax breaks? And if so, what evidence do you have that such tax breaks do more good than harm?
So that's pointed at me because that's probably my bill. And that's a bipartisan bill that I'm working on, and it's the B&O tax relief for rural manufacturers. Our economy around the state, every sector has rebounded from the recession except manufacturing jobs. We have continued to lose manufacturing jobs in Washington state. We know that manufacturing jobs, though, average about $80,000 a year with benefits in Washington state, and that's a documented fact. We know that in rural areas, we need more family wage jobs. So targeting the manufacturing rate to lower for rural and small manufacturers, the B&O tax rate to the Boeing preferential rate. This state already said for Boeing, we're going to give you a preferential tax rate to keep jobs in Washington state. So I'm working to say if it's good enough for Boeing and it kept the 777 in Everett and they've invested billions of dollars, I'm saying for that cross-laminated timber manufacturer in Montana who wants to move into rural Washington, why can't they have the same lower rate to create good family wage jobs? That's what we talk about in rural Washington. So this is a bipartisan bill. It came through committee on a bipartisan basis. It's going to be a bipartisan, and it's a bipartisan package next year. The interesting thing is, because we have so little manufacturing in our state, the fiscal note is almost non-existent to the state. So it's a chance to say, let's attract some new jobs, light manufacturing jobs to rural Washington to create family wage jobs. This isn't a corporate, this won't be for big manufacturers, this isn't for corporations, this is for Simpson Door Company that may want to move their plant into a rural community. This is exactly what we should be fighting for, is rural communities to create rural jobs. This isn't tax cuts to the wealthy. This is that individual who wants to move. Maybe they're in the Kent Valley, maybe they're in Seattle, and I want to move to East Jefferson County. I want to move to Clallam County. I want to rent some port space and build my manufacturing business. And if we lower that rate, that may just make the difference between coming to Washington and going to another state.
Ms. Wilke.
Well, this may be one area that we actually agree on. I do think that the B&O tax is really, in essence, an income tax on businesses. And I also, as a former business owner and having had to pay that tax, I also realize that it's based on your gross as opposed to your income. So I would like to see some modification of how that's done. And I also agree that certain businesses do get a special sweet deal, such as the Boeing deal. And I think that we can use a reduction of those taxes to attract businesses out here to the rural areas. We will have to have zoning that actually allows them to build factories big enough in order to encourage them to set up business out here, because without that out of the way, I don't see how they would agree to move their businesses out here. And we're also going to need to have housing for the people that will be working for them. So it's a complex situation. It involves more than just a tax reduction. I am a little bit confused, though, because there was this one bill that my opponent voted against called Concerning Revenue. And, it involved some B&O sales tax reductions and use tax exemptions for businesses. And it seems a little conflicting, but there may be details about it that I don't understand. I have to admit that. But I do know that our governor vetoed those parts of the bill, so he doesn't seem to be on board with reducing taxes as far as that's concerned, because of the loss of revenue involved in that. So as long as we're pushing back against those kinds of issues, it may turn out to be difficult to find true bipartisan support on that. So even though, without replacing the reduced tax revenue from B&O tax with something such as an income tax, which mostly we don't support.
Given the recent report regarding climate change and the short time frame we have to reduce the scariest of climate impacts by reducing greenhouse gases quickly, what do you think the state's role should be to reduce greenhouse gases and prepare for climate impacts?
Well, I certainly agree that we have to all make it an effort to support or to be careful with our environment. I don't think that there's any thinking person out there that says we should just go crazy and do whatever we want and not take a concern for the environment. But in the interest of doing those things, we also have to consider that we have people too, people that live out here and people that live everywhere really. So one of my concerns with this carbon tax that we have coming up, which I guess they want to call it a carbon fee, which basically there's no difference to that, is that it's going to unequally affect people who live in the rural areas. We need transportation to get every single thing out here that we use, all of the food that we use, and all of the businesses and travel that we do. And let's just face it, I know this for a fact because I've traveled around this district. There's a lot of distance to travel. So that's going to cause the cost of living to go up. The prices of our goods and everything that we use is going to go up. The cost of our gas is going to go up we are already the third highest in the nation. It's going to put us in the stratosphere if we pass that tax. I want to point out that the PUD's against it, and the trade unions are against it, and there's a number of businesses that have come out against this carbon tax. So what is the state incumbent to do? I think that the state needs to consider that we have to, if we're going to fight against something like that, we have to create a social circumstance through education of the people that we want to take care of our environment, that we don't want to abuse it, and that we leave our people, the citizens of our district, strong enough economically to endure any kind of fight that we need to endure against climate change. Thank you.
Well, climate change is real, and it's a serious threat to the future of our planet. I worked on a couple of bills that would actually, and one is moving Washington to 100% renewable energy by 2045. And that's a very doable plan, and it's for power generation because 98% of our power is already renewable with our hydroelectric dams. And this piece of legislation would have moved us to 100%. So that's a start. I also supported legislation that puts a per barrel tax on the oil tankers that take the Canadian tar sands and move up and down the Salish Sea. And that certainly was not supported by the big oil companies. I also am a large fan of letting people know that on the North Olympic Peninsula, our healthy forests, and we need to make sure that our forests stay healthy because when they burn, they're probably the number 2 generator of carbon into our atmosphere. And so healthy forests through thinning and through effective forest management, we can sequester much more carbon than we generate. In fact, most people don't realize, but the healthy Pacific forests sequester about 25% of the carbon the United States generates. So we can all be proud of the fact that we're actually living in a place that's sequestering more carbon than we're producing. And as the Vice Chair of Ag and Natural Resources, I'm in a strong position to advocate for good, solid forest management. And you're seeing that on the Forest Service now, they're moving forward with thinning projects so their forests don't burn. And the state is working with responsible forest management so our forests don't burn. The other thing, too, is when we bring that wood to market and it's put into a product like cross-laminated timber and other mass timber building materials, that carbon is sequestered forever. And a younger tree can take its place and begin to sequester carbon. The trees that are left behind as they continue to grow will sequester more carbon. I'm actually a fan, and the timber companies want to work with the legislature along with the environmental groups to come up with a plan so that we can get credit and recognition for the healthy forests we have.
I'm Chris Llewellyn. I'm an organic farmer in Quilcene. I am a big proponent of rural economies, and the organic farming has grown exponentially in our area and could be the solution to the greenhouse gases. There's a study out that says if everyone went biodynamic, organic, we could eliminate greenhouse gases. It's the conventional farming that helps put it out. So I want to know how we can balance a growing population. We need to feed our population. Right now in Jefferson County, people only buy about 4% of their food here, and we have the capacity to grow almost all of it. I mean, we can grow melons, we can grow grapes, we can grow just about anything you want in Jefferson County. So I'm saying let this district be different. Let us be innovative and be an example for the nation in creative housing and preserving our farmland, our forest lands, our pristine waterways that aren't so pristine right now. And I want to know what innovative things that you are going to put forward to help us in this unique area.
A couple of things, Chris. Really proud of the fact that when I was a county commissioner for 16 years, Clallam County, and Steve and I maintained that policy of no spray on Clallam properties. And disappointed to say that as soon as I left the Board of Commissioners overturned that rule. No spray along county roadways. We saw in Clallam County, and you know, that spraying of the county roadways can work its way into the ecosystem through the water. We saw, you potentially see bee pollination drop off as bee colonies collapse. So for organic farming, for someone who's doing it the right way, your local government, we shouldn't be spraying poisons onto our landscape. Number two, a couple of things that we worked on in the legislature, and a bill that I would love to see move forward, but there seems to be some resistance, which when I tell you what the bill is about, you're all going to wonder, like, who's resisting this? So most of the food we buy, most of the vegetables we buy in the grocery store, I have found out in my time in the legislature, is most of it is fertilized with composted human waste. And so we started, we've looked at a bill so that food would be labeled fertilized with composted human waste. I suspect if you walked into Safeway and lettuce was labeled, this lettuce was fertilized with composted human waste, that the organic market locally would skyrocket. That most people are not aware that your vegetables are fertilized with organic human waste. Now it is organic, it has been broken down. But I think that should be something I'm actually kind of curious, like I would like to know. I suspect now all of you are going to want to know when you take that piece of lettuce. I highly suggest that. So that's one of those bills that, like, that would really help local organic farmers. That would be something that then you could say and advertise, I don't use or human waste on my food. So it's a little thing, but it could be a game changer for local organic farmers. When we see it's a huge part of our economy, what's happened in Sequim, the Sequim Valley, some of the products we're known for. Also in Sequim, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're the #1 producer for cauliflower seeds in the Sequim Valley. I believe there's a huge cauliflower seed market out of Sequim. So we already have a thriving product. So.
Time's up.
I think I could get behind that bipartisan bill, human waste free. One thing that I think would really be great, I love your vision for the organic farming, and I also would like to see a lot more of that. Water use laws are also something that sort of is prohibitory for farmers out in the Sequim area especially, and maybe out here some too. But I've talked with port commissioners about the concept of also if we had larger warehousing, refrigerated warehousing in the areas that are nearby our airstrips, that might help. And that is something that the GMA currently limits the sizes of these buildings. So I think that if we work together with the local municipalities to try to get some of those barriers out of the way, it would be a great boon to the organic market. I agree with your vision on that matter. And not only would it bring food to the area, but it would also bring jobs to the area. And it's just lovely. I really like the idea. So I don't have too much more to say on that, except that any kind of industry that we can bring to our district is going to be beneficial, and it will help business owners, it will help families, it will help industry.
Question that was submitted in writing. Ms. Wilke, one of your main talking points is about reducing regulations. The reason we have regulations are because we can't depend on everyone doing the right thing regarding the public good or the commons. Can you tell us 3 regulations you would like to get rid of? And Mr. Chapman, can you address your thoughts on regulation? Ms. Wilke?
Well, I agree that we do need to have some regulations, that some instances people will overreach, and we've seen that in the past. I think that we also know where we have to be careful. But just like people can overreach opportunity, they can also overreach on regulations. And I think that the resulting decline in our housing industry is one example of how overreach has decimated the builders' market out here. So I would like to see, as I've mentioned many times, I would like to see, and there's probably way more than 3 different specific regulations in the GMA that we could slice and dice to bring to right size, I should say. So that is one area that I think is ripe for the picking as far as affecting the housing market. Let's see. So, yeah, I'm just going to leave it there because there's more than 3 issues within that one law that we can address.
Representative Chapman?
Well, one regulation that I worked on, and I'm glad it was a bipartisan bill, it was, so we were going to require wooden boats, and for people in Jefferson County, people understand the importance of the wooden boat industry to our economy, and what the state had passed before I got to the legislature was banning of copper paint on wooden boats by next year. It actually was supposed to take effect this year. And what happened is Bob from the supply shop down at the marina came to me and said, yeah, the problem is there's no product to protect our wooden boats. Copper paint is still the only product that's available. So I went to the Department of Ecology, and they admitted that California looked at a couple of products, but they were actually worse for the environment than copper paint. So we put together a bill that actually exempts wooden boats from the copper paint ban while we look and wait for industry, the folks that make this stuff, to come up with a better product. So that was a regulation that would have really hurt our wooden boat industry, not only in the Northwest, and there was no better alternative. With regards to the Growth Management Act, I will say I certainly served under, worked with that in 16 years as a county commissioner, and people want to criticize kind of where with growth management, but the alternative would have been the state legislature telling local governments and local communities how to plan for their future, where growth management required planning commissions of volunteers and elected bodies like city councils and boards of commissioners to make those decisions. Often Steve and I were there, and obviously Commissioner McIntyre were there in front of groups like this. So when you say you want to do it with Growth Management Act, what I hear is you want a top-down approach from the state of Washington. I like the Growth Management Act because I like the fact that as a county commissioner, I was held accountable by groups just like this for the decisions we made for the good of Clallam County, and I believe your county commissioners also are held accountable by voters just like you for the decisions they make versus a top-down approach from state government, which I have not taken as a state legislator because I'm very deferential to local government.
Hi, I'm Linda Abbott Rowe from Port Townsend. I was just in an effort to get to know you better. I was just wondering what sources you access for information. What are you currently reading? What have you read recently? Can you tell us that?
I read a lot of newspaper. I read both Paul Krugman and I read Pat Buchanan. And they both are run, obviously, in the Peninsula Daily News on a regular basis. Currently, I'm reading two really fascinating books. One is called Senator Mansfield, and for people who remember, Senator Mansfield was the longest-serving majority leader in the Senate's history as a Democrat from Montana, and he served from the 50s and through the Vietnam War conflict. And it's a very fascinating book of someone who had to work in a bipartisan way and lead the nation through a very tumultuous period, both in and really the difficulties he had in dealing with President Johnson, who had been his mentor when President Johnson was the majority leader before he handpicked Mike was appointed. Mike Mansfield had a saying in Montana. He was an old Butte farmer, copper miner, and in the copper mines they say tapper light boys, and he had a saying in the Senate when things got a little too partisan, he'd say tapper light boys, and that's a philosophy that I've tried to bring to the legislature is tapper light. Let's work together. We can do this, and proud to say the legislature works really, really well together, and the lessons I've learned from that book are helping me. Another book that I usually read two books at one time. So I'm reading a book called Crashed, and it's a history of how did our economy collapse in 2008, and it goes all the way back to the Nixon decision. Just started off with the Nixon decision to go off the gold standard, and kind of it looks like it's 800 pages, so I'm plowing my way through, but it looks like it'll take us right up and through our economy collapsing in 2008. I think that's important because of the fact that as someone who's a representative, I should be aware of economic cycles and help budget for those cycles. But I certainly read a number of columnists across the spectrum. I don't watch cable news. I'm done with cable news. I'm done with people yelling at each other. I read and study, and I really enjoy reading. So
I haven't had much time for cable news lately either. Mostly the things that I'm reading are issues specific. A lot of news articles from various different sources across the country and locally. So, people send me information and I read it and I look up information that's specific to issues that are going on in our district. I haven't had much time to read a book lately. This has been a huge learning opportunity for me to run for office here, and learning about all the various different issues that are important to our communities all across our district has taken up a lot of my time. So look forward to being able to fall back and read some books after this election is over, and I guess that's where we're at.
That's the time period we have for questions. We are going to ask each candidate to give a 3-minute closing statement. So we're going to start again in alphabetical order with you, Representative Chapman. 3 minutes, please.
So a couple of highlights. We had a 60-day session earlier this year. We balanced the budget. We fully complied with the McCleary decision. We cut your property taxes. And this year, we're going to put over $1 billion more into the state rainy day fund, fully complying with the constitutional requirements, thanks. And so we were able to cut your property taxes, finish in 60 days. A couple of highlights that we also did on your behalf. For the first time since 1943, on a bipartisan vote, we were able to update the Equal Pay Act for women. For the first time since 1943, on a bipartisan vote, we updated the equal pay law in Washington State for women. We had fallen behind Tennessee and Utah. That was an embarrassment, and that was a really good bipartisan bill. In fact, we had 18 partisan votes in Olympia in a short session. True enough. How many people think we had 100 bipartisan votes? Yeah, you're right. We did not have 100 bipartisan votes. In a short session, and the House floor, fully documented, we had 556 bipartisan votes to 18 partisan votes. And in fact, I sponsored 15 pieces of legislation. Prime sponsored 15 pieces of legislation. 8 became law. All had solid bipartisan support. What you learn in Olympia is like you learn in kindergarten, and what you learn in 3rd grade, and what we learned on a high school basketball team, and what we learned coaching. You got to get along to move good policy forward. Our leadership will move Republican bills forward if they're good policy. Our leadership will work with the Republican leaders. We're not a purely partisan body. 556 bipartisan votes in a short session. That's not 556 laws. There's a lot of procedural votes. There's a lot of issues. But that is 556 documented bipartisan votes to 18 purely partisan votes. That's a government, unlike Washington, D.C., that's working together. I'm fully embrace bipartisanship. Like I said, I prime sponsored 15 pieces of legislation, and they all had bipartisan support. 8 became law, and some of them are really significant pieces of law. So I'm really proud of that record. It's something I fundamentally believe in. I want to be part of a legislature that works for you. I want to be part of a legislature that works for this district. I want to be part of a legislature that walks across the aisle. I watched Representative Theringer late at night as we were trying to pass a capital budget, 2 o'clock in the morning, continually walk across to the Republican side to say, what can we do to pass this capital budget, as we had a stalemate right before we left session, because he knew that $47 million we were going to invest in the 24th legislative district, and that $69 million we were going to invest in the 19th legislative district just to the south of us, $110 million investment. He was not willing to leave the Capitol. None of us were willing to leave. Bipartisan works, and we finally did get to a bipartisan vote on a lot of issues. 556, if there's one number I want you to remember, 556 bipartisan votes to 18. I'll put that track record up. It's a track record I had as a county commissioner, and I'd love to continue that work for the next 2 years. Thank you very much.
Well, it is my honor to run for this seat, and I hope that you will consider my candidacy. I have a lot of experience in the private sector that puts me in a position to be able to understand many of these issues. And probably you've all heard before of the various different positions that I've held and my work with owning my own businesses and working in various different industries, including in construction, in boat building, and yacht manufacturing, and in the housing industry through mortgage and investment real estate. So I am conversant in those areas, and that brings a unique quality to the picture. I am also willing to talk across the aisle and make deals, consider other people's points of view. I'm very much interested in knowing what goes on with the people in our district, and I, at the risk of sounding negative, I will say one of the complaints that I received as I was out in the district was that they don't see our representatives enough. So I guess if I could pass that on in the instance that I don't win, try and get out a little more there. Maybe that would help. I agree with the idea of the bipartisan issues. The 8 bills that Mike was able to pass, I think that it's worth mentioning that a lot of these issues are I guess in a sense you could say no-brainers. Whether or not we should have extended the length of buses to include bike racks, that seems like a pretty easy issue. And the anti-fouling paint issue, broadcasting during an emergency and setting up areas for broadcasters, I think that's pretty obvious. And we can all agree these kinds of things are bipartisan and they need to be dealt with. But there are a lot of issues too that were not necessarily 100% bipartisan. So even if you have one person or 2 or 4 Republicans voting against the issue, you can still say that it's bipartisan. It's important that we do work together to come up with laws that will help our community. The biggest things that I see that we need help with is economic, because we do have a history of falling GDP, and increased unemployment in our area. Things may be getting a little better right now, and that could be just a reflection of the better economics in our country. So I think it's about time that the area that we are living in, which is really one of the most beautiful in the world, begins to see an economic revival. I'm sorry to see how much people tend to struggle in this area.
Can we give both our candidates a round of applause, please? Thank you both so much. Thank you for running for office. We know that's a lot of work.